There is this concept called a universe of obligation. It is a term coined by Harvard professor Helen Fine, and it looks like this concentric ring of circles. Each ring is said to represent the individuals or groups for whom we feel responsible, whose rights we seek to protect, and whose injuries call for amends. The first ring represents the greatest level of obligation. It contains those we believe worthy of our greatest sacrifices: parents, spouses, children, maybe even a close friend. Now, as the rings move outward, the level of obligation decreases. So a real danger begins to emerge to anyone who stands outside of our universe. The less obligated we feel towards someone, the less likely we are to act on their behalf. Some of the greatest injustices, from systemic discrimination, sexual assault, to genocide, have been perpetuated, not caused, but perpetuated, because the level of obligation required to prompt action was absent. With inaction, injustices become normalized and we become distanced by our differences. An us-them mentality emerges, where we come to believe that there is nothing we can really do to enhance another's well-being. Now, without action, a cycle starts to build, a cycle of barriers. Not a tangible barrier, no sort of a wall, but a human one. Now, I had none of this in mind when, as a freshman in high school, I began teaching science to students in low-income schools. You see, I love science. And I discovered that elementary students not far from my home had no science classes at all. So I began researching science curriculum, and I talked with teachers, principals, and the State Department of Education to see what I could do. I then called up 10 principals and asked if I could teach science at their schools. One principal said yes, and I began to teach weekly classes through an after-school daycare program. My personal mission was to show the students, none of whom I had met before, this world of science that I loved. I was there to teach, and I knew few details about the lives of these younger students. So I bet it's no surprise to you that the first 3 classes didn't go as expected. Each class was filled with side conversations and outbursts. 10-year-old JC made it very clear he did not want to be there. With sagging pants, a black cap he refused to remove, and a rather advanced vocabulary of Spanish profanities, he used his loud voice to rally the students each class, and in his words, protest science. 2 months into classes, something happened. The first lockdown of the year. A man with a gun had been spotted on campus. The intercom went off, and in an instant, I saw the students' faces drain. Some immediately began shuffling around the classroom, robotically shutting blinds and shifting desks. For these 10 and 11-year-olds, lockdown procedure had become routine. JC jumped from his seat and ran for the door. When I didn't allow him to leave, he began screaming and crying, saying he needed to make sure his sister in another classroom was safe. For 30 minutes, the 13 of us crouched in a darkened corner of the classroom. With arms wrapped around trembling students, one on each side, I wiped away tears until one student pointed out the water streaming down my own cheeks. That day, I realized something. This was the world the students lived in. Every day, a world of instability, chaos, and fear. The lockdown was just one short expression of a more pervasive insecurity. After my months of research, I had perceived a lack of science classes, an inadequacy in education as the urgent issue facing these students. What I had been unaware of were the day-to-day hardships and emotions they experience. My circle of awareness had not touched their universe. And this is where the human barrier surfaced. For 2 months, I had taught the students, been a stranger to their real stories. I knew the students, but I had not understood them. After the lockdown, I began to wonder to whom the students turned to after such incidents. With whom did they share their concerns and fears? I began staying after class and left an open invite for students who wanted to talk. I wasn't sure if any would take me up on the offer, but I thought it worth a try. Well, the students loved to talk, so regardless of what they said to me during class or how they behaved, they stuck around afterwards. And the stories they shared with me about their lives shocked, sometimes frightened, and often deeply saddened me. But they also helped me better understand the world the students lived in. JC was surprisingly one of the first students to, in his words, hang with me after class. He told me about his interest in cars and once mentioned the 3 jobs his mom worked from before he left school to late after he returned. "I'm thinking of helping her out later on," he said to me one day, looking down sheepishly. "During the summers?" I asked. "No, in the year, instead of high school," he replied. Sharing about his dad, whom he was no longer in contact with, JC once said, "I used to see him hit my mom. I don't want to do that to anyone, ever." JC was not the only one. More students began to share their concerns and fears. Ones like, "We don't have anything in the fridge. I think it's because my grandma got fired from work." Or, "My best friend's parent just got shot, and he is going to move." Stories of abuse, abandonment, violence, and poverty. Topics of the news and the subjects I learned about in school crystallized in the words of these students. And it was heartbreaking because they were kids with such big hearts abounding with innocence, and they couldn't see past the issues they faced. Most didn't know they were living in poverty or witnessing domestic violence. But what I found was that these issues did not stop them from dreaming big. When I asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, I heard the whole gamut of responses, from doctor to astronaut to author. One 3rd grader, Cassandra, told me she wanted to be the President of the United States. I began to discover their interest in different subjects and topics. When JC could not stop talking about cars, I began bringing in pictures and articles of cars. I will only show them to you, I told him, if you listen during class and learn first what everyone else is learning. The first day we tried this, there were no outbursts or attempts to protest science from him. I was shocked. Then science fair rolled around, and JC wanted to do a project on rockets, but his project hadn't been approved because the school thought it was too large in scope and there weren't sufficient resources. So JC came to me instead, and we worked together to build a rocket out of styrofoam, spaghetti sticks, and scraps of plastic. JC learned concepts like Newton's laws and drag force. And the best moment was seeing him present this with a huge smile on his face to his teachers and family. He took pride in something he had built, and that was invaluable. I discovered that when students felt they were being listened to and valued, when their interests were accounted for, they were respectful and determined in class. The more they began opening up about their personal lives and ambitions, the more comfortable they felt sharing in class, and the greater the effort they made. I heard less of, I don't care, and whatever, and more of, we can, and I want to. Students went from yelling in class, not paying attention, and being present only for daycare, to staying after class to learn and asking questions. I heard from other teachers that students were attending the after-school science classes, even if they skipped school that day. The science classes weren't simply classes. They were community. The students and I were family. We learned, laughed, and cried together. But most importantly, we listened and tried to understand each other. The best part was seeing the students work together. When we did an end-of-the-year project, everyone pitched in. The students chose to build a school garden, and even the ones who didn't like touching the soil and the bugs contributed. One student who liked to write interviewed his peers and wrote an article on why they decided to build a school garden. Another student who liked to organize created a watering schedule for the plants. The students trusted, respected, and relied on each other and me. And I went from being seen as the stranger who inflicted upon them this weekly curse of science to a confidant, mentor, and friend. And I believe that is the power of listening to connect. That initial science class for 12 students has spread to 10 other low-income schools today. I began asking other high schoolers to join me in serving as science teachers, mentors, and friends. And in the last 3 years, we have been able to teach 600 students living in high-poverty neighborhoods. I have seen these other high school volunteers encounter similar roadblocks and experience the same joys I did my very first year of teaching. The best moments have been when they call me up to tell me things like, Carlos is finally paying attention in class, or I don't think Mariana hates me anymore. The classrooms have become learning environments built on trust, acceptance, and love, places for students to share their dreams and relieve themselves of their concerns. I have sometimes wished our world could look a little more like these classrooms. It's not that these classes fixed the issues the students faced day to day. In fact, multiple times in hearing the students' stories, I have wanted to pull them out of their tough, sometimes life-threatening situations and show them this other side of safety and hope. While the classes didn't change the students' circumstances, they did help them discover and believe in their abilities. And I have found that this self-confidence is a powerful force that can change the students' choices. Earlier this year, a surprise guest arrived at the school I had begun teaching at the first year. Guess who it was? JC. That's right, he came back. He's a 9th grader now. He stayed in school. And he told me he just placed first in his district science fair. The first time in 7 years his high school has won any science fair competition. And then he told me something else. His winning science fair project was on rockets. JC is one of the many students whom I have seen go on to do great things, from excelling in school to initiating more school gardens. The most important lesson I have learned in teaching these students is that listening to understand each other is so incredibly important. Because when we don't understand, a fundamental disconnect between different worlds emerges. Essentially, the human barrier. We come to believe that there is nothing we can do about these issues, and we become separated by our differences. Our circle of awareness stops intersecting with the world of the other, and this cements the barrier and pushes us further and further apart. There is a Hawaiian parable some of you may be familiar with. A man goes out to the beach and sees a little boy picking up starfish that have washed up in the tide and throwing them back into the ocean. "What are you doing, son?" the man asked the boy. "Do you see how many starfish there are? You will never make a difference." The boy pauses, and throwing another starfish back into the ocean, he says, "It sure made a difference to that one." I too believe we can make a difference. What if we opened our universes of obligation so they extended further than they do now? What if we tried listening to connect, to understand each other on a daily basis? Perhaps the next time we go out, we can try catching a story that matters. And gradually, through human connection, we can begin turning human barriers into human bridges. Thank you.